Okay, here we are again in my nerd cave, bringing you a video about the panel I ended up using in here, which was my second most common question that I got asked, which is, Jay, why did you use the ultra wide and not the BFGD like you said you were going to use? So today we're going to talk about that. We'll talk about some of the specs on this, my personal opinion on it, and then we will do that. Corsair is proud to present their new Hydro X line of custom water cooling products. The new XG5 series radiators offer the perfect balance of fin density and airflow to keep your loop cool and quiet. The XG7 water blocks feature full coverage cooling for your GPU, while also maintaining an aesthetically pleasing design, while the XC7 and XC9 CPU blocks keep all your modern CPUs nice and cool. To see the complete lineup of Hydro X cooling products from Corsair, click the link in the description below. Okay, so about 7 months ago, something like that, I said I was going to be using the BFGD as a centerpiece in my new gaming room, and clearly I didn't do that. Because since then, the advancement and the updates coming to the LG C9 have made it the best of both worlds as a gaming panel for a game room or even a HTPC, and also has all the color accuracy of OLED plus WebOS and all that sort of stuff. So I'll probably do a separate piece about the C9, although LG did do a campaign about that. I wasn't a part of it. I bought my C9, so I think it'll be an interesting perspective to see, as somebody who spent retail on that, how I feel about it. But LG did send me this panel behind me, which is the 38-inch ultra-wide plus WQHD plus. We'll talk about what that means in a second. GL950G-B. So it is a G-Sync panel, but it's 38 inches. So I felt like it really fit the gap between having a giant panel that I can't sit in front of because I'm farsighted and have to sit so far back. This room would never make sense if I did that. Moving to something now that's bigger than a 34-inch standard 21:9 ultra wide, which I've been using now for several years, and gives me more screen real estate and a few extra pixels. So let's go and start with some of the specs. The reason why they call it a WQHD plus is because it's a 3440 by 1600. So there's an extra, 160 pixels tall. Instead of being 1440 tall, it's 1600. Very similar to a 16:10 panel, but only in an ultra-wide version. So one of the things I didn't like about 21:9 panels, although I got used to it, was how it was really wide and really narrow. The height was really short on it. It felt like I was looking through the periscope of an M1 Abrams tank, but I eventually got used to it. So now having it be wider and more screen real estate, the screen real estate's the same, it's just wider, right? But being a little bit taller did give me a little bit extra real estate and made the panel feel less like I was looking through a periscope. But it's bigger, because I wanted a bigger panel. I always used to use multi-panel setups in the past. I've used a single 21:9 now for a long time. I just wanted a little more space without taking up the room to put another panel on the desk. So the size of this panel was perfect for that. Now in terms of specs, they are calling it a 21:9, even though it's got that 1600 vertical height, 3840 by 1600 nano IPS display. So if you're not too sure about what our nanocell is, then you can check out our original video we did several years ago about what nanocell is. But basically it's an extra membrane layer between the pixel gate and the lighting source, which is giving you even more color accuracy. But it is an IPS panel as well, so you can expect the color accuracy from that, which happens to be DCI-P3 98% with a 1 millisecond response time. I don't have all the proper scopes and stuff to truly measure the 1 millisecond response time. I can tell you right now in terms of using it though, it doesn't feel like it has any sort of ghosting. High response time panels or stuff that's higher than, let's say, 10 milliseconds. Definitely has a bit of a trailing, right? You move the mouse, you'll see kind of like a comet trail behind there. That's not something that I've been experiencing with this panel when you don't deal with the overclocking. And we'll talk about that in a sec, because when it comes to overclocking, it is a 144 hertz panel, overclockable or overdrivable to 175 hertz. It's a VESA display, 100 by 100, and HDR 400 with Sphere Lighting 2.0. NVIDIA G-Sync, pretty straightforward. When you're running it at the standard 144 or less, you actually get 444 color space. When you overclock it to 175 hertz, that drops down to 422. So what you are having to sacrifice when you go from 144 hertz to a faster overdrive is you lose color accuracy, which in my opinion kind of takes away the whole point of having an IPS, especially a nanocell IPS panel. So at the price point that this panel is, and we'll talk about that at the end, it kind of is not a good trade-off in my opinion. I'm actually running this at 120 hertz. we did that video about whether or not we can tell the difference between 120 and 144. I find 120 to be about the sweet spot if I leave vertical sync or G-Sync or any of that stuff on, and then we have it sort of lock it at that refresh rate. It takes a little bit of a workload off of the GPUs, plus I don't notice a difference anyway, so I personally leave it there. I did play around with the 175 Hertz though, and I can tell you what starts to happen with that pixel overdrive is you start to get really bad chromatic aberration, as well as kind of a pink haloing around the pixels. Also too, the faster that you run it, because of that color space, like I said, text also starts to look pretty bad. I don't see the reason to go to 175 Hertz. I know some people have gone as high as 200 Hertz now on the ultra wides. I don't think pro gamers that would want 200 to 244 or higher are playing on ultra wides anyway, so it's kind of a weird trade-off that they made there. It's, I guess, cool that you can do it, but what you sacrifice in terms of getting the extra refresh rate, totally not worth it. Maybe it is to you, but it's not to me. So it is HDR 400, which means that you're gonna get some of the extra stops of dynamic range, which is gonna bring you more details in the lowlights and more details in the highlights. I don't tend to game with HDR on very often, but it's nice that it has it for if you're watching movies or Netflix and stuff on your screen. But you know, it's one of those things where you have to have it on or off at all times. So I basically just leave it off personally. But again, at the price point, having HDR is at least worth it. And we'll talk a little bit more about the HDR in a second when I get to the pros and cons section. There's one other feature in this panel called their Sphere Lighting 2.0. So it does have a ring light on the back of the panel, which is what's actually illuminating the wall behind me, not just the desk. It does have the basic colors. It has like white, red, I think orange, cyan, those types of colors, which I do have set to match my desk right now. It does have a disco RGB mode, which is rather bright. In fact, the LED is extremely bright. Fortunately, it's got a scroll wheel on the bottom so you can quickly turn it down or turn it up in terms of brightness. But it also has sort of an ambient mode where it will see what's happening on the screen and it will project those colors on the back wall, making your panel a bit more immersive. It kind of brings your lighting to, I don't know, real life, if you will. It's been kind of the thing people have done lately with their home entertainment centers is just using kind of ambient light. I know Philips Hue makes one. So it does that automatically if you want it to. So if you're gaming and such, it brings a little bit extra level of immersion to it. Now, when you turn the panel off, by default, the light will stay lit unless you go into the menu settings and have it turn off when the panel goes to sleep. One thing I've noticed with this panel though, and again, lots of settings you can go into the menu and play with, is sometimes even if you're using the panel, it will automatically want to shut itself off after so many hours, even if you're using, playing the game or using the computer or it's on, then you'll have to go in there and kind of like push a button and say, don't turn off, which is not that big of a deal, but I tend to have to turn it. I leave that function on because I walk away from the computer all the time and I don't want it burning up power. So it will automatically turn itself off and you can just turn it back on. Now let's talk about some of the build here for a second. It's a thick boy, just like me. It is about 1 inch thick when you measure it at the edge. Now a curved panel is a little bit different. Although the curve is very subtle on this panel, fortunately, the first curved panels that came out, man, they were trying to make those wraparound screens so that, like you go into those 3D theaters or whatever and it's got the screen all around. Fortunately, we've got away from that, where all we've done now with the curve on something this big is just make it subtle so that it doesn't have any sort of color shift when it looks at the panel. Although this panel wouldn't suffer from color shift from an off-viewing axis anyways, because it's got 178 degrees of viewable range, and that's because it's IPS. At the top, there's a vent where lighting does like shine through, but it's also red in there. Fortunately, you can't see it. I think LG's feels just obligated to put red in anything that they call their gaming stuff. Even the base has red in it, but it's on the back, so you can't really see it. I think that's their way of saying, red's our color for gaming, and we're gonna put it in there, whether you like it or not, even if you can't see it, but whatever, I digress. I obviously have it mounted to an arm. This is a cheap Amazon arm from a company called Mount It. So original, right? But it holds the weight of the panel just fine, as you can see. It articulates, it rotates. I'm happy with it, and I think it cost me like 50 bucks or something like that. With being a VESA 100x100, you have lots of options when it comes to mounting. On the back of the panel, you have your input and output from LG. DisplayPort, it's got HDMI, it's got 2 USB 3.0s with a hub connection on there, so you've got to use a standard USB, like large USB connection to a PC, which I'm using a 10-foot cable on. So I plug my webcam and stuff into the back of the monitor when I'm using it. I unplug it and stow it when I'm not. So that's pretty convenient without having extra cables there. I've got the power brick and everything running through the arm, so as you can see, it's floating without any cables hanging down. which is pretty awesome. On the back, inside that ring light is a vent as well. There is a fan inside of this panel helping keep it cool. I've seen some complaints of people saying the fan made a squealing noise over time. So far, I've never even heard the fan. I didn't even know it had a fan until I started looking into that comment. It definitely seems like a very well thought out panel. Let's go and talk about some of the things I'm not a huge fan of. When it comes to the HDR 400 is pretty much the weakest HDR that you can get. I mean, HDR 1000 is kind of like the standard when it comes to TVs and such. The actual brightness of this panel is 450 CD typical, 360 CD minimum. So it's not a super bright panel, which is fine for me. Like I said, I leave HDR off in most instances because there's two problems here, and this is more personal and subjective. But with HDR 400 being the weakest of the HDR standard, that means the details in the lows and the details in the highs, which would normally clip or be well out of range and turn to white or turn to black, they're weak as it is. The details just aren't there. It puts, well, they are there, but they're still hard to see. It puts a little bit of an extra strain on the GPU to have HDR enabled, so I tend to not leave it on. The flip side, the panels that are HDR 1000, which I've taken a look at, BFGD being one of them, it's too bright. It just completely blasts your face with light. That's why I tend to just leave it off and leave everything in standard color, or standard SDR. There we go. Standard dynamic range. Geez, apparently I'm bad at panels right now, right? Contrast ratio though, it has a 700 to 1 minimum, 1000 to 1 minimum. Now, a lot of you might look at that and go, oh my God, that is nothing. Why these people advertise like 1,000,000 to 1? This is a very realistic number. When you have ambient light going and you're measuring contrast ratio on something that emits light that's not an OLED, obviously the fact that you have something that's backlit and trying to make a black is not going to go perfect black. Until we see OLEDs in monitors, you're not going to see an infinite contrast ratio like you would pretty much see with an OLED. So a lot of people freak out at these numbers because what you tend to see in a lot of marketing material and spec sheets on other panels are flat out lies. So seeing 700 to 1 minimum, 1000 to 1 typical seems very, very realistic to me. In terms of weight, without a stand, it's 16.8 pounds. So if you're gonna be looking for a monitor arm or something to hold it up, like I said, the one I'm using obviously works just fine. I don't even have it loosened. You loosen the screw to make it stiffer or hold more weight. But at the end of the day, it does what I want it to do. It's pricey though. It's $1,700. So, excuse me, $1,799. You can buy the 55-inch LG C9 TV for $400 less than this panel costs. So in conclusion, the 38-inch is a very expensive niche market, obviously. I don't think there's lack of people buying it, or they obviously feel there's a market for it, or they wouldn't make it. I think most people would take the $1,800 and upgrade their system or build a heck of a system. I think if you already have a 34-inch ultra-wide of any sort, or any sort of mid to high range panel, it wouldn't make sense to go to this panel. I feel like if somebody had taken my 34-inch that I had hooked up prior, because before this came in, I had the 34-inch, the GK34950F hooked up prior to this. I feel like if Phil were to like switch it on me at night and then I walked in here and sat down and played at the computer, I'm not sure I would have necessarily noticed right away, with the exception of the backlighting being on, because the other one doesn't have backlight. I don't think I would have necessarily noticed right away much of a difference. So it really depends on what your current circumstances are. Clearly your financial circumstances are going to play into whether or not this panel is worth it to you. Whether or not you can look past the fact that the advertised overdrive is kind of worthless. The HDR 400 is really weak when it comes to HDR performance. If you just want the biggest ultra wide you can currently buy, this is it. And I think we'll see the price come down quite a bit over time. It's just going to depend on how fast the other brands can start getting into the 38-inch market. But considering the fact that LG is kind of like the panel OEM for so many brands, I wouldn't be surprised if LG is kind of hanging on to it for themselves right now. But again, things are just really kind of upside down in the world, and who knows what the scenario is going to be in the future when it comes to these panels. So if you're using this panel and you actually have it, put your comments down below on how you feel about it. How do you feel about this panel at its price point and its feature sets? And if you guys think there's a different panel that's worth looking at that's cheaper, then go ahead and sound off in the comments below. My official recommendation would be The 34 GK950F being the FreeSync validated G-Sync or G-Sync validated FreeSync panel has a better feature set at a much cheaper price if you don't care about the extra 160 pixels of height and the extra 4 inches of diagonal viewable screen space. So there you go, guys. That's why I ended up using this. I couldn't sit at the BFGD, and it wouldn't have worked in this space for as well as I wanted it to, and it makes more sense to build a set around it back at the studio where I have a warehouse to fit that giant thing of a panel. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Hope you're enjoying this kind of a throwback feel as I'm working from the new Nerd Cave. You'll see some more videos from here because we are social distancing as best that we can. I want to keep Phil safe. I want to keep ourselves safe. And so, yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and take this footage and upload it to our server where he's gonna grab it and edit it. That's how this works. I really miss him making fun of me.